Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our August 1st. Oh, and happy August. It's August 1st. Yeah, welcome to our webinar on statutory default provisions. When documents are silent, what is the answer? My name is Elena Gilbert, and I will be presenting this webinar today. So, as you know, we are going to go through a few housekeeping things real quick here. Meanwhile, you can enjoy the meme. So first of all, if you've been on our webinars before, you already know this, but the bulk of your screen should be the PowerPoint. And then off on the left-hand side is the presenter, me, hello. And then on your right-hand side, there's a private chat icon. And that is what you're going to click and type in your questions as you have questions throughout the presentation. Of course, I know you won't because I'm going to be so thorough. Kidding. So yes, that's where you would type in your questions. I am going to wait until the end, as always, to go through questions, only because I want to make sure we get through all the materials first, and then we'll cover as many questions as we can, hopefully all of them. If you are having any audio or video problems as we are doing this, please, there's a little button down at the bottom that asks you audio or video problems. Click on that button. It'll take you through a few steps and hopefully clear up the issue. I can't do anything on my end here while I'm presenting. Somebody just said, I want a lawyer who knows the judge, right? That's good. You will get 1 CMCA credit for attending. These are going to be automatically emailed to you probably within 1 or 2 days after the webinar. They're automatically generated. If you're not seeing it by the end of the day tomorrow, please shoot us an email and we will absolutely get you another one issued. At the end of the slideshow, you will have my email address on there, but you can also email, probably should email, education@altitude.law, and then we'll take care of getting you another one. Just a reminder, we are recording this webinar and it will be on the Altitude YouTube channel probably by Monday. So you are welcome to watch it, rewatch it, or, you know, tell your managers and board members to watch it. The only issue is if you're rewatching it on YouTube, you do not get the credit for it, but you certainly get the knowledge that comes with watching this. And last but not least, there will be a survey at the end of the presentation that will pop up automatically. I always ask that you take just a couple minutes and fill it out if you can. It really helps us kind of correct things that aren't great. It gives us ideas for other classes. And, you know, there's no such thing as bad feedback as far as we're concerned. So kind of let us have it. Tell us what you think. And we read everything and we do take it seriously. So appreciate your time if you can spare it. Well, all right. Let's get started then so we can make sure and get through everything. So what are default provisions? Default provisions are essentially statutory provisions that kick in when our documents don't give us any information on a subject. Okay, so if the documents are silent, the statute sometimes gives us some fill-in-the-blank information that we can use, which is very helpful. These default provisions don't require specific authorization. They basically say, hey, unless your documents prohibit it or provide something different, this is what it is. Okay, so it doesn't require homeowner approval. And it is subject to whatever limitations may be set forth in our governing documents. So if there is a conflict, because this question always comes up, well, what if our documents say something different? Then you have to follow your documents. With the default provisions, these only apply when your documents don't have anything to the contrary or are completely silent. All right. And so the other thing is I tried to divide this into 3 categories. for the default provisions. The first one we're going to go through is default powers. Then we're going to go through some default definitions, and then director requirements, although they're not all directors. There's an officer requirement, and there is a committee chair requirement as well, but I just generically called it director requirements. Where do these requirements come from? You will see I'm really focusing on two statutes, the Colorado Common Interest Ownership Act, aka CCIOA, and the Nonprofit Act. And everything's going to be labeled. And unless I tell you otherwise, when we go through these CCIOA default powers, it applies to communities created before and after CCIOA. And I will let you know if that's not the case. So just assume all of this applies to all communities regardless of age. All right, so let's talk about the default powers. Adoption of rules. CCIOA actually says, unless your document's prohibited, the association can adopt rules. And that means there's no homeowner approval associated with that. A lot of times we see owners getting upset with their boards for adopting certain rules, and they try to argue that the association doesn't have authority to adopt these rules because there's maybe nothing in the governing documents that talks about rules or that there's authority to do that. And in those cases, we say, well, you're right, there's nothing in the governing documents, but statutory rights do allow us to do this. The caveat with rules is they can't conflict with anything in our governing documents. So they can't conflict with your declaration, articles of incorporation, or your bylaws. And so there's a few other kind of very specific rules, but as a general rule, you can adopt rules and regulations on behalf of the association. Retaining contractors, signing contracts. Again, another authority that the board has. I bet you have all gone through a situation where you had an owner who was not happy with a contractor and decided to take the approach of, you as the board cannot sign a contract without homeowner approval. You should have gone through the homeowners to do this. I'm sure some of you have seen this, have been through it. Well, the answer is no. Unless the documents require us to go through the homeowners, which they really usually do not, under CCIOA, we have the right to retain contractors and to sign contracts on behalf of the association. Regulating common elements, regulating of common elements. I think that's an extra word, but what are we talking about regulating common elements? We're talking about maintenance, use, repair, replacement. So one thing that for some reason I've seen a lot more lately, and I think it's just because people are generally more upset and are looking for things, is in condominium communities, I'm seeing paint projects, and I'm seeing certain homeowners who don't particularly like the color that the board has chosen, and they make a stink over it. And they send letters, and in one case, I actually had an attorney send us a letter saying, you can't pick this color, this does not look good. I mean, it was crazy. But the ultimate answer is, sure we can, because it's a common element, and we as the association regulate the maintenance of the common elements. We also regulate the use, right? The repairs and the replacement. So with respect to regulating the use, that is also where your rules come in, policies, resolutions with respect to what's allowed and not allowed on common elements as far as what kind of activities are prohibited, what kind of conduct is prohibited. So this is another way of the statute giving the associations the right to adopt rules and other documents that govern the use of the common elements. Repair and replacement. We as the board get to decide whether something needs to be repaired, how it gets repaired, when it gets repaired, who repairs it. Same thing with replacement. These are all statutory rights of the board. And again, unless you have documents that say something different than that, you are golden. All right. Next one. Enforcement of covenants and rules. So we could get into the weeds here if we wanted to, but we're not going to because we're not just talking about enforcement. But under CCIOA, the association has the right to enforce covenants and rules. And the issue is, as you have all probably seen, 2 years ago with HB 1137, we have a lot of structure around how associations can now enforce rules and the specific process, that has to be followed to be able to impose fines and to be able to eventually get the file over to legal counsel. So we still have to do that. All of that has to be followed. But this just says that even if your documents don't say you can enforce the provisions, you can. Okay. So remember, with our enforcement, there's all sorts of fun things we get to deal with, but notice and hearing before imposing a fine, we're capped at $500 per violation. So most of you, I would think, have the updated enforcement policies that go through the enforcement process with the 2 30-day demand letters and 7 days in between. It's crazy. It's a crazy process, but again, there is the right to enforce. Adopt budgets. So with budgets, again, this could be a whole other class when we talk about the budgeting process. But what this provision says is the board, unless otherwise provided, gets to adopt a budget. And this kind of goes hand in hand with the CCIOA budget process, which now applies to all communities, regardless, of when they were created. And I'm going to just briefly talk about this because it is still somewhat of a default provision, but it's really more of a requirement. And what the budget process says is board adopts budget. After board adopts budget, it sends a summary or a copy of the budget to the owners, and it calls a meeting, a budget ratification meeting. At that meeting, it doesn't matter if we have quorum. Quorum is actually not required, and that's the only meeting you're ever going to have where quorum is not required. And if a majority of all owners don't veto the budget, it's automatically ratified, which means it's approved. So it's kind of a backwards requirement where instead of the board looking for approval from the owners, the burden is on the owners to come in and veto the budget if it's really that egregious. So this is, like I said, it's a requirement depending on, when your community was created and what other provisions it has. It is subject to limitations in the sense that you can still have provisions in your documents that require homeowner approval before a budget is ratified. So this, just because this is a default process, it doesn't mean that if you have some more stringent requirements in your documents that you don't have to follow them. You still do. So owner approval, if you have a cap on assessments, that requires approval if you're going over the cap. If you have a requirement for owner approval with respect to special assessments, you still have to follow what your documents say. And if you don't have any specific language about a special assessment, I'm just going to do this real quick. Next year, we're going to have a whole class on this, just so you know. If you want to impose a special assessment and your documents are silent on special assessment, the association has to go through the budget ratification process again, which means you're adding a line item for income, which is the special assessment, and a line item for expenditure, which is whatever you're spending that money on. And then you submit that to the homeowners, you have your meeting, and you go through the same ratification process. All right. Oh, institute litigation on behalf of 2 or more units. Again, this is something that CCIOA authorizes associations to do unless you have something different in your governing documents. The association does have that right. We see it most often when there's construction defect claims. and it impacts, a whole bunch of units in the association. We see associations utilizing that. Of course, with construction defects, there's additional hoops that associations have to jump through, but this provision basically allows the association to initiate legal action as long as it's on behalf of 2+ units in the association. Okay. I love this meme, by the way. We can impose late fees on delinquent assessments. So that's pretty straightforward. Just so you know, there is no cap in CCIOA on what the late fee can be. So associations can set the late fee to what they want. If you have a provision in your declaration that says, your late fee can't be more than X, you obviously have to stick with that. Also, the late fees can't be so high that they're considered usurious, which means 45% or more of the total debt. And the total debt is actually what the entire annual assessment is. It's not what you pay each month. It's what the total comes to at the end of the year, because usually associations have an annual assessment and it's just payable in monthly increments. And if that's what your community does, then usury is going to be 45% of that total per unit that you pay per year. Okay, so it's still pretty high, but be careful, because when you add interest into that, which is now capped at 8%, it's very easy to get up high, and we want to be careful with that. Next, rent out common elements and impose fees per se. So what does that mean? For those of you who have clubhouses, do you rent them out for private events? Do you rent rooms in there for meetings or other things? So that's what this is talking about. It allows associations to rent out portions of common elements. Like if we have a playground, maybe we can rent it out for a birthday party, for a kid's birthday party or something. So these are the types of things that this refers to. It doesn't mean we get to charge owners in addition to their assessments to simply use common elements. If I live in the community, I'm going to go use the pool, you can't charge me extra for that under the guise of, hey, we're renting this to you. No, we're talking about beyond regular use. And also, this does not apply when we're talking about limited common elements, which again, it's kind of commonsensical, but I live in a condominium, my balcony is a limited common element. You can't charge me to go out and use my balcony, right? So this does not apply to the limited common elements. All right, this next set of powers is for post-CCIOA communities only. When is it post-CCIOA? It's after July 1, 1992, on or after July 1, 1992. By the way, what has to be July 1, 1992? How do you know when the association was actually created? Most people go and say, hey, it's when the Articles of Incorporation were filed. And that's actually not the correct answer. The Articles of Incorporation create the corporation. They do not create the common interest community. What creates the common interest community is when the original declaration is recorded. So that's what you have to look to. Look at the date your declaration was recorded and see if it's on or after July 1, 1992 or before that. Anything before that is considered a pre-CCIOA community, and anything on July 1st and after is a post-CCIOA community. So what can associations do that are post-CCIOA without specific authority in their governing documents? They can acquire real property, which means you can buy land. You can buy a unit within the community. You can buy land adjacent to the association, and the association can own it without it necessarily being a common element. It's just real estate that's owned by the association. Why would an association do that? I mean, you never know. There's different reasons. We may want to buy this land and build something on it. However, again, be careful, because a lot of times associations assume that if we own land, it's automatically a common element, and that's just not the case. There's an analysis that goes with that to determine if it's a common element or not. So don't just assume because the association owns land that it's automatically going to be a common element. We can grant easements and licenses over common elements, over common areas. What is that? What does that look like? The best thing I can think of is we see a lot of like Comcast type easement requests from Comcast to bury cables and things like that. And sometimes, you know, the government wants to bury things there. And so there's easements that are granted. And for post-Kiowa communities, you can grant that easement whether or not you have specific authority in your governing documents. If you don't have that authority and you're a pre-Kiowa community, it's questionable whether or not you can do it. The safest option is to say, no, we can't do it. We have to amend to add this authority to our documents. Some associations have pushed that envelope a little bit, and what they've done is they've relied on certain verbiage in the Nonprofit Act to say that, hey, we have a right to grant easements under the Nonprofit Act, and they relied on that, which we generally don't recommend, because if there's ever a conflict between Kiowa and the Nonprofit Act, Kiowa does have a supremacy clause which says the terms of Kiowa is going to govern over the terms of the Nonprofit Act. So again, it's a bit of a risk if you're pre-Kiowa and you don't have authority to grant easements over common area and you decide to do it anyway. Somebody could challenge that. This next one is fabulous, and I bet most of you didn't know about it. Access to a unit when reasonably necessary to maintain common elements. This is awesome, sort of, right? It's, what does it say? It says we can enter a unit if it's reasonably necessary for us to go there in order to get to a common element and maintain it. I just actually had a situation that I had a meeting about just yesterday, where I have townhomes and there was a sewer line that ran underneath several units that association needed to replace. It was bad. And so the only way they could get to it was to go into the units and get, basically destroy their flooring, their subflooring, so they could access that pipe. And that was really the only way they could do it. And so if their documents were silent about them being able to do that, they still would have been able to do it because they are a post-Kiowa community, and this provision of Kiowa allows us to do that. So when is it reasonably necessary to enter a unit? It's a little bit of a judgment call, but I would say it's reasonably necessary if that is the only way to access a common element, or if the only other alternative to access a common element is going to cost us like $50,000 more or something like extremely large. If we're talking about like a $2,000 or $3,000 increase, we might not be able to argue that it's reasonably necessary to enter the unit. So obviously, we're always recommending you get permission from the owners. Don't just enter their units. Use common sense, make sure you're safe. But this is a provision where if you do have an owner who's saying, I'm not letting you in my unit because I don't have to, it's my property, you could then pursue them in court regardless of whether your declaration has this language based on this Kiowa provision. Okay, so it's a good provision to have, and we actually use it more often than we think. One thing to keep in mind with this is that a unit, Kiowa defines a unit in multiple ways, but essentially a unit can be a lot, and a unit can be a condominium unit. So when we look at it that way, this provision allows us to enter a condominium unit. It allows us to enter a lot and possibly a residence on that lot if reasonably necessary. Okay. Next one is also fabulous that we don't use enough, and that is the board may act in all instances on behalf of the association. I wish this applied to all communities, but this goes really well when we have homeowners who question the board's authority. And they're like, well, you need to present this to the homeowners. You can't just make a decision about, fill in the blank. Well, yeah, we can, because the board may act in all instances on behalf of the association. The association is a nonprofit corporation. Nonprofit corporations, brace yourself for this, nonprofit corporations are not people. Wow, right? They can't speak for themselves. So how do nonprofit corporations, or any corporations for that matter, function? How do they make decisions? We elect a board of directors. And that board is the body that collectively makes decisions on behalf of the corporation. Okay, so the board is, I like to think of it as kind of like the brain of the association, for lack of a better term. It's the one making the decisions. And under this provision in Kiowa, at least for post-Kiowa communities, the board is entitled to make the decisions in all instances on behalf of the association. Now, of course, there could be a few exceptions. There are things, of course, that homeowners have to be provided to homeowners for approval and things like that. So this is not an end-all be-all, but it is a very important provision, which I actually cite to it quite often when I'm writing informational letters to boards or to homeowners explaining why the board has authority to make certain decisions. Hey, now we're in the Nonprofit Act. So this is going to apply to communities regardless when they were created. And these are all things that Kiowa does not speak to exactly and does not contradict. And so this is going to apply to all your associations. And we're still on default powers, but now we're looking at the Nonprofit Act. Make and amend bylaws. So what this provision says is the board can make and amend bylaws unless specifically prohibited, okay, from doing so. Okay, so you might have bylaws that say these bylaws may be amended with approval of a majority of owners, just to make it easy. And I have associations that look at that and they say, so the board can't approve any changes because it has to have homeowner approval. No, that's not the case. Because what the nonprofit says is you have to have specific prohibition in the bylaws from having the board amend. So when it says these bylaws may be amended by the owners, there's nothing in there expressly prohibiting the board from amending. So what would be an express prohibition? Well, if you had a provision that said these bylaws may only be amended by approval of homeowners, that's a very different provision. That one says this is the only way you can do it, which means all other methods are prohibited, and then we cannot have boards approve bylaw amendments. But unless you have that kind of language, the board can amend bylaws. Nonprofit says even if you can amend the bylaws board, you can't change quorum. Okay, so that's not something that can be done without homeowner approval. Post-Kiowa communities have additional prohibitions on what they can amend unilaterally, and so they can't change director terms, director qualifications, or board powers. Okay, so those are all things that cannot be changed by the board for post-Kiowa communities. But they can still make and amend bylaws specifically. All right, sell and dispose of real property. So remember in Kiowa, we had the right to acquire real property. So the nonprofit says you can sell and dispose of real property. Caveat with that is for communities created after Kiowa, if you are trying to dispose of a common element, so if it's real property, that's not a common element, that's fine. If it's a common element, post-Kiowa communities have a requirement, can get around it. 67% of all votes in the association have to approve the sale or other disposal of common elements. Okay? So don't just assume you can sell whatever property you want. All right, this next one is also fabulous. Hold electronic meetings. This is what we rely upon when we hold our virtual meetings that we started doing back in the day of COVID, right? What does this provision say? Again, unless it's expressly prohibited in the documents, which we don't typically see, you can hold an electronic meeting where the attendee can hear everyone and everyone can hear the attendee. So what does this really do? This allows for conference call type meetings as long as we can hear. It doesn't say you have to see them, you have to be able to hear them. This allows for our Zoom meetings where we can see and hear, but we don't have to, again, see them. You can have your camera turned off. It allows for the types of meetings where they're kind of hybrid, where you have some people showing up in person and other people are up on the screen because they're joining virtually, as long as we can hear them and they can hear us. That's the only requirement. And so this is really the provision that we rely upon with our electronic meetings. At some point, you know, the statutes will become more up to date with respect to the 21st century and the technology that's available. They're not right now. There's a lot still to be done, but I think this provision is enough to hold us over so that we can continue to hold the electronic meetings. Next one is create and disband committees. So if you don't have specific authority in your documents that allows the association, the boards, to create committees, guess what? You have it here. Nonprofit Act says you can do this. Kind of a funny thing about this one, is that the way this provision reads is it says, yes, the board can create committees, appoint committee members, and disband committees. So something's missing here. It doesn't say we can remove committee members. We can appoint them, but then it doesn't say anything about removing them. I think this is an oversight because ultimately we can still disband a committee, and that means we're going to remove everyone from that committee because the committee doesn't exist. So my typical opinion is, yes, we can still remove members, but if someone's really going to be a stickler about it and want to go to court over it, then at that point my recommendation would be disband the committee and then create the committee and appoint new members. And that doesn't include this one person. That's how we get around that. But it's an interesting thing about this particular statute. All right, moving on. All right. Another good one, pledge income stream as security for a loan. Why would you need to pledge your income stream as security for a loan? Because that is the only thing that banks currently accept as security when HOAs take out bank loans. So this is only for pre-Kiowa communities. Keep that in mind, make a note, pre-Kiowa communities only. And we're entitled to pledge our income stream without homeowner approval. For post-Kiowa communities, we can only pledge our income stream if the declaration authorizes us to do it. And if there's a homeowner approval requirement, we got to follow that as well. Okay, so if our documents are completely silent as to pledging the income stream as security in a post-Kiowa community, we cannot do it. You have to amend your declaration to add that language. Can't do it otherwise. And I know there's a lot of associations currently looking at bank loans because things are getting very expensive. And frankly, people aren't sure how they are going to pay for it. So the first thing you should do when you're thinking about that, look at the date your declaration was recorded, and then look to see what kind of language you already have in there. with respect to pledging an income stream for security. The last power I want to talk about is the mail ballot vote. So the statute actually calls it a written ballot, which I find to be stupid because, let's face it, most of our ballots are in writing. And so calling something a written ballot doesn't distinguish it from the ballot we pass out during meetings. So we call it a mail ballot vote because you're actually distributing a ballot to the owners. Few things to keep in mind. Again, if your documents do not prohibit mail ballot voting, and I don't think I've actually ever seen a set of documents that prohibit this, we can do anything that the homeowners vote on can be done through a mail ballot. What's the advantage of using a mail ballot vote? There's a few. One is you don't have to have a meeting. And two is you can spread your voting period for about 60 days where you can collect ballots. This is really good in situations where associations are trying to amend their governing documents, especially when you're amending your covenants. Typically, we're looking at 67% of all your owners to amend. And if you're doing it at a meeting, the chances of 67% of all your owners showing up at a meeting and voting in favor of an amendment is very slim to none. And that if you're doing it at a meeting, it's a one and done. If you don't get the vote at the meeting, now you got to do it again. So the benefit of using the mail ballot is that we can, if we're doing it, for example, to amend the documents, we have a voting period of about 60 days during which we can knock on doors, we can call, we can email, reminding people to submit their ballots. And that works really well when you have a really high owner approval requirement. However, just a word of caution, if you plan on using the mail ballot process, I highly, highly, highly encourage you to use the association's legal counsel to draft the specific documents, meaning the ballot solicitation letter along with the actual ballot. There are some very specific things that need to be included in each of those documents that the Nonprofit Act has as a requirement. If you're missing even one, it's not going to be a valid vote, and then you're going to have to start all over again. And so it's just not worth the risk. If you're drafting it yourself, at least have your attorneys review it. Okay. All right. Let's go to default definitions. But before we do that, I want to talk to you about this picture. Big Beaver Road, exit 69. This is not a meme. This is an actual photograph. I have many photographs of this because this happens to be an exit along I-75, which runs pretty much from Michigan down to Florida. And this is the north side of the Detroit metropolitan area. And this is an exit that I passed many times throughout my life because I grew up in Michigan. And this is an exit that until I moved out of Michigan, I never thought twice about. It was just an exit. And when I moved out of Michigan, I started seeing it as a meme, and then finally it hit me. I'm like, oh my God, really? I swear to you, never have I thought twice about it. I think most Michiganders who drive along that corridor of I-75 don't think twice about it. But, maybe it's just me. Maybe I was the oblivious one. But I had to share that with you. And plus, if you take that exit, you are going to be in a really, really posh neighborhood. And there is this mall that kind of spans two sides of Big Beaver Road. And one side of it is like a Rodeo Drive type of a mall where it's like the most expensive like stores, like the kind that are just designer stores that you would like never really go by yourself. But if you're there, you want to go and see it. Anyway, so that's just my story. But let's talk about unit boundaries now. All right, unit boundaries. So this truly, really is going to apply to your condominium communities for the most part, because what this says is, again, post-CCIOA, it says if the only definition you have of your unit boundaries is the finished surfaces of the perimeter walls, floors, and ceilings, then this applies. In other words, you don't have any clarity on what a finished surface is, what's included in it, whether, for example, drywalls are part of the finished surfaces or unfinished surfaces. And so when it's that vague, CCIOA says, here's how we interpret it and here's what it is. Drywalls are going to be part of the unit. Lath, furring, wallboard, all part of a unit. Obviously, any finished surfaces, carpet, paneling, tile, interior fixtures, all part of the unit. Things like shutters, doorsteps, porches, decks, balconies, and exterior doors and windows are limited common elements. This part comes in very handy because a lot of times there's confusion over doors and windows in condominium communities and who has to maintain them, and are they part of, are they the condominium unit or are they a common element? So this basically tells us if all else is silent, your exterior doors and your windows are limited common elements. So when we're looking at maintenance obligations, for example, we are going to look and see if limited common elements are an association obligation, if the declaration is silent with respect to these particular components. So it's a great provision to have. I wish it applied to pre-CCIOA communities, but for your post-CCIOA communities, we take advantage of this quite often. All right. Now we're on to definitions. Oh, we're still on definitions. Sorry. So these next two definitions are actually, one is CCIOA, the top one's CCIOA, the bottom one's Nonprofit Act. And they, depending on when your association was created, that's what's going to determine which one you look at. So obviously for your post-CCIOA communities, you're looking at the top requirement, which basically says if your documents are completely silent as to what quorum is, and you have 1,000 or less units, which is most of our associations, it is 20%. If you have over 1,000 units, it is 10%. Again, this is only when documents are silent. I can count the number of times I've seen documents that did not contain a quorum requirement on one hand. Okay, so it's extremely rare to see that, but it could happen. If you're a pre-CCIOA community, then the CCIOA doesn't apply, and then you have to use the default in the Nonprofit Act, and that's 25%. Okay, so those are the default quorums. Director requirements, and again, this isn't exactly just director requirements, but I just grouped it into that. So director qualifications, these are all, except for the last one, Nonprofit Act. These apply to all communities regardless of the date they were created. Director qualifications, you have to be an individual. An individual what? It doesn't say, but an individual. What does that mean? That means if your bylaws, usually your bylaws, or any of your other documents do not speak to director qualifications, like you have to be an owner, you have to be a member, you have to be in good standing, you have to live in the community, whatever you want to kind of put in there. If you don't have any of that in your governing documents, anyone can be a board member. It could be the garbage man who drives to your community once a week. It could be a renter. It could be someone who lives in another state. I mean, it could be anyone. And you don't get to control, as the board, who gets to run for board positions. If they get elected, they get elected. Okay? So in that sense, we always want to make sure that our bylaws do contain director qualifications. And if they don't, we probably want to add some. But remember this, if you're a post-CCIOA community and you're adding director qualifications to your bylaws, you have to get homeowner approval, as we talked about earlier. See, the board can't just do it on its own. Next is officer qualifications. So our president, vice president, secretary, treasurer, they have to be over 18 years old and an individual. Now we're talking, right? So you have to be an individual something, and you have to be at least 18 years old. But other than that, again, you could be the garbage man who's driving through the community on a weekly basis. You could be anybody, as long as you're 18. So for the same reason, we really want to make sure that our bylaws also contain specific requirements to be an officer. For example, you have to be a board member, you have to be a member of the association, I mean, whatever it is. My recommendation is that it be someone from the board who also serves in the officer capacity, because otherwise it gets too complicated as to roles and responsibilities. But it doesn't have to be that. Terms of board members, one here if your documents are silent. This we see more often, especially with older documents. Sometimes they didn't put director terms, and it just says, you know, you're going to appoint a board of 3 members, and that's all it says. So what that means is every year, every single term is going to be up for election. And that is not a good situation to be in, because hypothetically, you could have a new board every single year. And you are going to have no continuity of knowledge or experience or anything else for that matter. So my recommendation, of course, is that we don't do 1-year terms. And if you do see 1-year terms, or if you see no terms, that we would recommend an amendment to the bylaws actually creating a term. Again, if you're post-CCIOA, terms must be approved by homeowners. Another thing to keep in mind is that if you're pre-CCIOA, condominium, the Condominium Act, which is almost obsolete except for this one provision, the Condominium Act says that you have to have at least 1/3 of all director positions expiring every year. So it essentially creates a mandatory staggering of board members that associations have to comply with. So if you are a condominium community created before CCIOA and you don't currently have staggering, you have 1-year terms, you probably want to get that addressed as well, because you're going to need to amend your bylaws to come into compliance with this requirement. I'm sorry, I know I'm not supposed to take a drink while I'm teaching, but it's like my throat is getting very dry. Okay, last but not least, committee chair. This is a CCIOA provision. It applies to all communities. To be a chair on any committee of an association, you must have you must meet the same qualifications as you would to serve on the board. So if to serve on the board, you have to be an association member in good standing and living in the community, for example, then those same requirements come into play for someone to be a committee chair. Now, you can be on the committee without meeting those specific requirements, but as a committee chair, you have to meet those requirements. Okay. And I think we are going to look at the wisdom of Morgan Freeman very quickly here. Yes, wise man indeed. And I'm going to go through questions now. I'm going to start at the bottom, and there's not that many, so I think we can actually get through all of these. Let me see. If the board decides to do a special assessment and an owner is requesting a variance because the owner just painted their home without board approval, can an owner be excluded in the special assessment? Can't answer that question without looking at the documents. It is going to be document specific, and whether the declaration allows an association to actually make that kind of an exception. A lot of times it doesn't, and the homeowner is going to have to pay the special assessment regardless of whether they benefit from it or not. But it is a document specific question. To veto the budget, is it over half of all owners in the community or in attendance? It is more than 1/2 of all owners, okay? So 50% plus 1. It's not 51%, but it's 50% plus 1 owner, okay? All right. If you are not increasing, I assume, assessments, and it is a pre-Kiowa community, can you not do the budget review? No, you still have to have a budget meeting and a ratification, even if you're not raising assessments, because until you do that, your old budget is going to continue to stay in place. And so even though we may not be increasing assessments, I know we're moving some things usually around from year to year as far as allocations and things like that. So you do still need to go through the ratification process. What about if a homeowner wants to purchase HOA land? So with that, it's really falls under the discussion we had of, is the land common area? And is the community pre or post Kiowa? If it's a common element and it's post Kiowa, you need 67% of all owners to approve that kind of a purchase. If it's pre Kiowa and they want to purchase common elements, then you have to look. If it's silent, then the board can do that on its own. If it's not silent, you got to look at the requirements in the governing documents. If it's property like real estate that is not a common area, again, unless there's something different in the governing documents, the association does have the right to dispose of real estate, as we saw in the Nonprofit Act. Can you access a unit in a condominium to perform the backflow test in order to prevent the water shutoff for all the units? So that one, I think you can ask for permission. You'd have to argue that it is reasonably necessary, which it probably, might be if you're performing maintenance to a common element. If you are looking to prevent, a possible future event by checking a component that the homeowner has to maintain, then you don't have the right of entry under the statutory provision we talked about. There would have to be something different, something more specific in the governing documents themselves. Can a mail ballot prohibit proxy votes and or write-in candidates? The board for board member openings and elections. So when we use the mail ballot, we never use proxies. Proxies and mail ballots are mutually exclusive. Proxies are used when we have a meeting, and that is a way for an owner to be able to attend a meeting without physically being there and be able to vote at a meeting without physically being there. With a mail ballot, because we're not holding a meeting, there is no need for a proxy because no one's showing up. If you want to vote, you got to fill out the mail ballot and send it back. That's the only way to vote. There are no proxies. Okay, and then what was your other question? Your other question was, can we prohibit write-in candidates? No, write-in candidates have to be allowed just like you have to allow nominations from the floor. So it's something that you are going to have to leave blanks in your mail ballot for write-in candidates. Could you repeat if the owner approval is required for loans for post-Kiowa communities if the decks allow it? So if the declaration allows it and it does not require homeowner approval for your post-Kiowa community, you do not need homeowner approval. If your declaration is silent, then you are going to need to amend your declaration to actually add a provision allowing the board to pledge income stream as security. It's not the loan, it's pledging the income stream, okay? And if your documents are post-Kiowa and it allows the income stream pledge with homeowner approval, then you got to get the homeowner approval. If you're pre-Kiowa, then you can do it unless your documents require homeowner approval. All right. Is there guidance on who is responsible for what is between the surfaces, i.e. between the interior drywall surface and exterior siding, such as insulation, wires, etc.? If we're talking about a condominium community in this case, then that would be the association, because everything behind that drywall becomes a common element. Okay, and so it is, I mean, because you're outside the boundary of the unit. So absent any other language, that's something that is the association's obligation to maintain and repair. Our first recorded declaration was 1990 and is pre-Kiowa. Am I correct that communities can later become a post-Kiowa community? How can we find out if our community later opted to become a post-Kiowa community? Great question. So there's a process to opt into Kiowa, and it is not the same process that you go through. Like, for example, you know, a lot of associations rewrite their documents. So created in 1990, in 2015, we rewrote our governing documents. That does not make you a post-Kiowa community. Okay, you're still a pre-Kiowa community. The only way you become a post-Kiowa community is if you have a separate vote of the homeowners to opt into Kiowa. And the approval requirement for that is actually 67% of those who are voting, as long as a quorum of homeowners vote. That being said, I do not recommend you have your communities opting into Kiowa if they're pre-Kiowa, because now you're going to have to do a whole bunch of additional stuff, and you're going to be bound by a whole much more of additional requirements that you may not currently be bound by, because they are only for post-Kiowa communities. So if you're amending your documents, you can take advantage of a lot of the post-Kiowa provisions that we like by adding them in, but you don't have to be bound by the additional requirements, like insurance, for example. You have very specific insurance requirements when you are a post-Kiowa community. And so right now, with insurance rates skyrocketing, if you're a condominium community, you really don't want to be bound by those requirements, because you have to insure the unit when you're a post-Kiowa community. So be careful. Don't opt into Kiowa. Just take advantage of the good provisions by amending. That would be my recommendation. All right. Sorry, I'm trying to figure out where I am. What is the difference between a director and officer? So a director is a board member, and an officer is somebody holding an office position, which is president, vice president, secretary, treasurer. So most officers are also board members. So they're officers and directors. If you've ever heard the term director at large, that's a board member who doesn't hold an office. But most officers are directors, but not all directors are officers. Why did Kiowa come up with a pre and post Kiowa? Was there no laws governing HOAs pre? No, there wasn't. There wasn't. All we had was the Nonprofit Act before that, and that doesn't govern HOAs. That governs nonprofit corporations. So it didn't address a lot of the HOA aspects, or most HOA aspects of common interest communities. And Kiowa was created based on a Uniform Act, and it was adopted and made into law effective July 1, 1992. All right, last question. I apologize if I didn't get to some of you. Can a mail ballot, can a mail ballot vote prohibit proxy voters? Okay, we already did that one, sorry. How can you ensure secret ballot votes with electronic meetings? A lot of times you can't. The short answer is a lot of times you can't. There are some platforms that I know exist that allow for secret ballot voting, like Election Buddy. That's the one that comes to mind, Election Buddy. I know it has a way to do that, and I've had associations using Election Buddy, and I know there's others that allow for secret ballot voting, and that's how you would do it if you are going. You have to get that platform and get it all set up, but a lot of times you cannot do that. Last one, sorry, now it's last one. So post Kiowa and limited common element, which side does the maintenance come down on, unit or association? If its governing documents are silent. If your governing documents are silent, The association under CCIOA is required to maintain all common elements, period, end of story. That includes your limited common elements. So it would be the association. The only thing homeowners are required to maintain, absent any language in the covenants, is their unit. So all common elements are association, all unit components are homeowner. All right, thank you so much for attending. Really appreciate you guys being there. If you can take the little whatever thing at the end, I would really, really appreciate. Thank you all, and we'll see you next time, okay? Bye-bye.